The morning sun stretched across the wide plains of the Cole Ranch, its golden light spilling over the fences, corrals, and weather-beaten barns that had stood for decades. Ethan Cole stood on the porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand, staring at the endless horizon that used to bring him peace. Now it only reminded him of how empty things had become. His wife had passed away 3 years ago, and ever since then, the ranch felt less like a home and more like a burden that refused to die. He was a man of few words. Grizzled from years of hard work, his hands rough and his eyes sharp. Trust didn't come easily to Ethan, and after losing his wife, it became nearly impossible. The ranch had once bustled with ranch hands, cooks, and helpers, but as his temper grew shorter and his patience thinner, they all left one by one. Only the livestock remained loyal, and even they seemed restless these days. When Maria arrived 3 months ago, she was a quiet young woman in her late 20s, soft-spoken and polite. She had been recommended by a neighboring rancher who said she was dependable and hard-working. Ethan hired her reluctantly. He didn't like strangers in his house. But he needed help. The dust gathered faster than he could sweep it, and the rooms carried the stale scent of loneliness. For a while, things went smoothly. Maria cleaned, cooked, and stayed out of his way. She didn't pry or gossip. Ethan liked that. But then, small things began to bother him. A silver pocket watch that belonged to his father went missing from the mantelpiece. Later, a few $100s he'd kept in a kitchen drawer couldn't be found. A week after that, he noticed his wife's old jewelry box sitting slightly ajar. Though he was certain he hadn't touched it at first, he brushed it off as forgetfulness. Age, he told himself. You're getting careless. But when it kept happening, his mind began to twist the coincidences into suspicions. Maria was the only one who had access to the house. She was quiet, yes, but too quiet, perhaps. Always glancing down, avoiding eye contact. Maybe that was guilt, not modesty. Ethan tried to convince himself he was overreacting. But once a seed of mistrust is planted, it grows fast in the soil of loneliness. He started watching her through windows, taking note of where she went, what she touched. She always seemed careful, methodical, like someone hiding something. One afternoon, he saw her leave the house clutching a small cloth pouch. She tucked it into her coat pocket before walking toward the barn. That image stayed in his head all night. He considered firing her outright, but part of him wanted proof, hard proof. Years of running the ranch had taught him never to act on guesswork. So he decided to catch her in the act. The plan came to him late one night as he sat alone in the living room, the only sound the ticking of an old clock. He would pretend to fall asleep in his chair while she cleaned, keep his eyes barely open, and watch. If she really was taking things, he'd see it for himself. That thought gave him a grim sense of control. Finally, he would know the truth. Still, as he finished his coffee the next morning, a sliver of unease crept in. It wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about trust, something he hadn't felt in years. Whether Maria was guilty or not, Ethan Cole was about to learn just how heavy suspicion could be when it turned inward. The next few days on the ranch passed slowly, with Ethan Cole's thoughts circling around his suspicions like vultures over dry land. He couldn't shake the image of Maria's quiet movements, her eyes always downcast, her hands always busy. Every time she passed by him in the hallway, polite and soft-spoken as ever, he wondered what she was hiding behind that calm expression. Ethan had lived long enough to know that people weren't always what they seemed. His father used to say, the ones who smile the least are often the ones with the sharpest knives. Those words echoed in his mind now. He didn't want to believe that Maria was stealing from him, but the missing watch, the cash, and the jewelry box, all those things, weighed heavy on his conscience. So he decided he'd stop wondering and start watching. That evening, after finishing his supper alone at the long wooden table, Ethan walked through the ranch house and studied his surroundings like a hunter preparing a trap. He noted the living room, the most natural place for his plan. Maria usually came in there last, dusting the shelves, cleaning the corners, and straightening up before she left for the night. It was quiet, open, and easy to observe. Ethan figured he'd make it look as though he'd fallen asleep in his favorite armchair. He'd even go as far as leaving a half-finished glass of whiskey on the side table, like a man too tired to bother finishing it. He knew Maria wouldn't disturb him if she thought he was asleep. She was respectful that way. But he also hoped that her guard might drop if she believed he wasn't watching. He thought about cameras, too. A few years back, his nephew had shown him how to set up small motion cameras around the property to keep an eye on the cattle. He still had one tucked away in a drawer. It was old but functional, battery-operated, and small enough to hide among the books on the shelf. So, that night, Ethan dug it out. He wiped off the dust, checked the batteries, and positioned it carefully between two thick leather-bound ledgers that hadn't been opened in years. It had a clear view of the living room, his chair, the mantel, and the side table where he planned to leave a few tempting items: his silver pocket watch, a folded wallet with a few bills sticking out, and his keys. He knew how it looked, manipulative, even petty, but his heart was set. He needed to know the truth. He told himself it was for his own peace of mind, but deep down, it was about control. The ranch might have been falling apart in places, but he wanted to feel like he still ruled over something, even if it was just his suspicions. When he lay down in that chair the next evening, he rehearsed everything in his mind. The timing, the breathing, the steady rhythm of a man drifting into a deep sleep. He loosened his boots, leaned back, and practiced a slow, convincing snore. Outside, the cicadas hummed, and the air smelled faintly of hay and old wood. At exactly 9:30, Maria's soft footsteps approached down the hall. Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He let his eyelids flutter closed, breathing through his nose, pretending to fade into dreams. The creak of the floorboards grew louder, then paused. For a moment, he thought she'd turned away, but then he heard her step into the living room. The faint clinking of cleaning supplies followed, the soft rustle of fabric, the faint scent of lavender polish. Ethan Cole lay still, every nerve alert under the mask of sleep. He thought this would be simple, a trick to catch a thief. But as he lay there in the dim light, listening to her careful movements, something strange stirred inside him. It wasn't anger or suspicion anymore. It was something closer to guilt, and he didn't yet understand why. The next evening arrived with a hush that only wide stretches of open land can hold, a quiet so deep that even the whisper of the wind through the dry grass felt like a secret. The sun sank low over the Cole ranch, painting the fields in burnt orange and gold. Inside, Ethan Cole prepared for the night. Like a man setting bait for a wary animal, he'd spent most of the day convincing himself that this was the right thing to do. It's not spying, he told himself. It's protecting what's mine. But the words didn't sit comfortably. Still, he had already gone too far to turn back. Before dusk, he checked the little motion camera he'd hidden on the bookshelf. The red light blinked once when he powered it on, proof that it was ready. He adjusted it slightly, making sure the angle captured the entire living room, his chair, the mantel, and the side table where his test items would sit. He even tested it by walking across the room, watching the light flicker faintly to confirm movement was being recorded. Then came the second part of the plan, the stage. He arranged the living room just as he wanted it. The heavy leather chair angled toward the fireplace, the lamp turned low, and a few temptations left in plain sight. His silver pocket watch, the same one he had thought Maria had taken weeks ago, lay beside a small pile of mail. A folded wallet with a few bills poking out sat next to it, and his old pickup truck keys glimmered faintly in the lamplight. It all looked casual, natural, but Ethan had rehearsed it down to the last detail. He even left his reading glasses on top of a half-open book, as though he'd been reading and simply dozed off. When the house was ready, he checked the time. 8:45 p.m. Maria usually began her final round of cleaning between 9 and 10. That gave him just enough time to settle into his sleeping position. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, not to drink but for authenticity. The smell alone, sharp and smoky, filled the room and added a touch of realism to the scene. He took a single sip to calm his nerves, then placed the glass beside the watch. As he lowered himself into the chair, he thought of his wife, of the many evenings they had spent right here, her laughter echoing softly as she read by the fire. The memory hit him unexpectedly, leaving a tightness in his chest. The house had never been this quiet when she was alive. Maybe, he thought, that was part of why he was doing this. Not just because he suspected Maria, but because the silence had become unbearable, and suspicion gave him something to feel again. He shook off the thought. He couldn't afford to get sentimental now. At exactly 9:30, he heard the soft creak of the back door. The familiar rhythm of Maria's footsteps carried down the hallway. She always entered quietly, her shoes barely scuffing the wooden floor. Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly, keeping his eyelids almost shut. He could see just enough through the narrow slits to watch the edge of the room. Maria moved into view, her apron tied neatly, her hair pulled back. She carried a small caddy of cleaning supplies and a folded cloth over one arm. As always, she paused briefly near the doorway, scanning the room before she began her work. Ethan's heart thudded painfully, not from fear, but from the tension of waiting. She started by dusting the mantel, her motion slow and careful. She didn't look at the watch or the wallet, though she passed them several times. Then she straightened a framed photo of Ethan's late wife and hesitated. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her face softening. Ethan, pretending to sleep, caught the faint sound of her whispering something he couldn't quite make out. It wasn't the behavior of a thief. It was something else. Something gentler. The plan, which had seemed so simple hours before, suddenly felt like a trap, not for Maria, but for him. The clock in the hallway ticked softly, its steady rhythm echoing through the still air. The house, dimly lit and hushed, felt almost sacred in that moment, a stage set for a truth Ethan Cole wasn't entirely sure he wanted to find. Maria stepped into the living room with the quiet grace of someone used to moving through silence. Her small frame seemed to carry the weight of the entire house as she crossed from shadow to shadow, her every motion measured and gentle. She didn't see Ethan's half-open eyes watching her from the chair. Her first stop was the mantel. She ran her dust cloth slowly over its surface, moving framed photos, an old clock, and a ceramic horse his wife had loved. Ethan's breath was steady, his hands relaxed on the armrests, but inside his pulse thudded like a drum. Every few seconds she passed within arm's reach of the bait he'd left. The watch, the wallet, the keys. She never touched them. Not once. Instead, her attention was drawn, as always, to the photograph of his late wife, Laura. It was a black and white picture taken the summer before her death. Laura had been smiling then, truly smiling, her sun hat tilted, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. Maria picked up the frame, wiped the glass carefully, and then, unexpectedly, spoke to it. "Signora Laura," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I still can't forgive myself." Ethan's eyes fluttered open a fraction wider, though he didn't move. The air felt suddenly heavy. Maria's words came out soft but clear enough for him to hear. "You were so kind to me, always. You trusted me. The day of the accident, I should have stayed longer. I should have checked the fence, like you asked. Maybe the horse wouldn't have run out. Maybe." She trailed off, her voice breaking. Ethan's chest tightened. His wife's accident, a riding fall that had killed her instantly, was something he'd never spoken about with anyone. He'd assumed Maria didn't even know the details. But now, hearing her speak as if she had been part of it, part of that day, sent a shock through him. Maria set the photo back gently on the mantel and wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She moved toward the window and opened it slightly, letting in a soft, cool breeze that rustled the curtains. "The ranch misses you," she whispered again, this time to the wind, not the picture. "And he does too, even if he pretends not to." Ethan froze. The words hit him harder than he expected. She turned back toward him then, studying his still form. Her expression was unreadable. Not fear, not guilt, but something closer to sorrow. She walked over quietly and, to his surprise, reached down to adjust the blanket draped over his legs. Her touch was careful, almost maternal. "You shouldn't sleep in that chair every night, Senator," she murmured softly. "Your back will break before winter comes." He wanted to open his eyes, to say something, anything, but the guilt and shame tangled in his throat like barbed wire. He stayed perfectly still, forcing his breathing to remain slow. After a moment, Maria straightened, collected her cleaning supplies, and began humming quietly, a Spanish lullaby Ethan had heard her sing once to a stray cat outside. There was no trace of deceit in her voice, no nervous glances toward the valuables. No sign of the greed he had imagined. When she finally left the room, the faint scent of lavender and lemon oil lingered behind her, along with the silence so thick it nearly suffocated him. For a long time after she was gone, Ethan remained seated, staring at the dim glow of the dying fire. The ranch was quiet again, but his mind wasn't. The story he had told himself of the dishonest maid, the thief under his roof, was falling apart, and as guilt crept into the empty spaces where suspicion had lived, Ethan Cole realized something deeply unsettling. He wasn't sure who had been watching whom that night. Ethan Cole sat frozen in his chair long after Maria's footsteps had faded down the hall. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound left in the house. The air felt heavy, thick with something he couldn't name, guilt, confusion, maybe even shame. He'd planned this night to expose deceit, but instead, he'd uncovered something far more complicated. He replayed her words in his mind. "I should have checked the fence. Maybe the horse wouldn't have run out." It made no sense. He hadn't known Maria had been there that day, the day Lavra died. Back then, everything had happened so fast. Lavra had gone out for an afternoon ride like she always did. When her horse bolted and she fell, Ethan was miles away, inspecting cattle fencing on the north pasture. By the time the hands found her, it was too late. He remembered Maria faintly from that time, a new helper Lavra had hired without telling him. Young, shy, and hard-working. But he'd been too consumed by grief to notice much about her back then. After the funeral, he dismissed the whole staff, unable to stand the constant reminders of his wife. Maria must have left quietly, without protest. And now she was back years later, working in the same house, carrying a guilt he'd never known existed. Ethan rubbed his temples, fighting the sting of tears that surprised him. He was not a man who cried easily. The loneliness that had driven him to mistrust her now twisted into something uglier, regret. Still, part of him needed confirmation. He had the camera footage. He would check it in the morning, see the truth for himself. Maybe then he could untangle the mess of emotions spinning through him. The following morning, the ranch woke to the sound of crows and the hum of a tractor starting in the distance. Ethan's back ached from sleeping in the chair all night. He stretched, the blanket Maria had tucked around him slipping to the floor. For a moment, he just stared at it, a simple gesture, yet it carried more sincerity than any words he could have asked for. He turned to the bookshelf and removed the small motion camera from its hiding spot. The light still blinked faintly. His fingers were unsteady as he plugged it into his old laptop, the machine humming to life with a mechanical groan. He clicked through the recordings until he found the right timestamp, just past 9:30 the night before. The footage showed exactly what he remembered. Maria entering quietly, dusting the mantle, pausing at the photograph, and speaking softly to it. But there was something more, something he hadn't noticed in person. After she spoke to the picture and covered him with the blanket, she lingered beside the chair. For a moment, she simply looked at him, not with suspicion or fear, but with tenderness. Then, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small wildflower, a pale yellow one that grew near the edge of the pasture. She placed it gently on the armrest beside his hand before leaving the room. Ethan's throat tightened. He paused the video and stared at the screen. That flower hadn't been there when he first set up the scene. He was sure of it. Somehow, in all his scheming, he'd missed that single, quiet act of kindness. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The realization hit him like a punch. While he had been pretending to sleep, Maria had been saying goodbye, not to deceive him, but to make peace with the past. She wasn't the thief. She was the only person on that ranch who still carried the memory of his wife with any warmth. The watch, the wallet, the keys, all still there, untouched. The only thing missing was his pride. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a whisper. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt small in his own home and utterly ashamed of what he'd done. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, scattering pale gold light across the worn wooden table. Ethan Cole sat there in silence, a mug of untouched coffee cooling between his hands. The old ranch house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. He had been awake for hours, turning the events of the night over and over in his mind. Maria's words haunted him. The video replayed in his thoughts, the trembling confession to his wife's photograph, the tears she wiped away when she thought no one was watching, and the single wildflower she'd left beside him. That flower now lay on the table in front of him, delicate and fading. Ethan had spent half his life priding himself on being a man who could read others. On the ranch, that skill was survival. You learned to read the weather, the cattle, and the people you hired. But with Maria, he had failed completely. His mistrust had blinded him. He pushed the chair back and stood, squaring his shoulders. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he owed her an apology and the truth. He found her outside, hanging freshly washed sheets on the clothesline. The wind tugged at the fabric, making them billow like sails. She worked quietly, humming under her breath, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Ethan hesitated a few paces away, suddenly unsure of himself. It had been a long time since he'd said sorry to anyone. "Maria," he said finally. She turned, surprised but not startled. "Senator Cole, good morning. You're up early." He nodded stiffly, his hands deep in his pockets. "Could we talk a minute?" Her brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded and wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course." They stood in the yard, the sound of the wind and the faint lowing of cattle filling the silence between them. Ethan struggled to begin. His throat felt dry, and his pride, always his armor, made every word heavy. "I need to be honest with you," he said at last. "Last night, I wasn't asleep." Maria blinked, her eyes widening in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I pretended to be," he continued, forcing the words out. "I thought you'd been stealing from me. So I set up a camera in the living room and watched you work." For a moment, the only sound was the wind flapping the sheets. Then Maria took a slow step back, her face paling. You watched me?" Ethan nodded. I did. And I shouldn't have. I know that now. Hurt flickered in her eyes, not anger, but deep disappointment. You didn't trust me, she said quietly. No, he admitted, his voice cracking. And I was wrong. I saw the recording this morning. You didn't steal anything. You didn't do anything wrong. I've been living with ghosts, Maria. My wife's death, this house, it's like I can't see anything straight anymore. Maria's gaze softened slightly, though her lips trembled. You thought I came here to take from you, she said, more to herself than to him. But I came back because I owed her, your wife, something. I was supposed to check that fence the day she fell. She told me she'd take care of it, but I should have insisted. I've lived with that guilt ever since. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her pain. You were just a girl, he said. That wasn't your fault. Lavra loved writing, she knew the risks. I never blamed anyone but myself. Maria looked away, tears glinting in her eyes. Then maybe we both needed forgiveness. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind tugged at the sheets, and one corner slipped free. Ethan reached out instinctively to help her pin it back, their hands brushing for the briefest second. I'm sorry, Maria, he said softly. For doubting you. For spying. For letting my grief turn into suspicion. She nodded slowly, her expression calm but unreadable. Thank you for saying that, Senator Cole, she said. Then, after a pause, she added, but trust doesn't come back with words. It takes time. I know, Ethan said. I'll earn it. She gave a faint, weary smile. Then we'll see. As Ethan watched her return to her work, the weight on his chest loosened just a little. The truth had been painful, but in speaking it, something inside him had begun to shift like a locked door slowly creaking open after years of rust. The days that followed their uneasy conversation stretched long and quiet. The ranch, usually filled with the hum of daily work, now felt wrapped in an invisible tension. Ethan Cole went about his routines, mending fences, checking the herd, fixing tools, but his thoughts never strayed far from Maria. She still worked diligently, never missing a chore, never showing open resentment. But something in her had changed. Her usual soft humming was gone, replaced by a careful silence. She avoided lingering in the same room with him for too long, and when she spoke, her words were brief and polite. Ethan noticed everything. Every quiet avoidance felt like a reminder of what he'd done. The guilt gnawed at him constantly. He'd meant his apology when he gave it, but it hadn't erased the damage. He could still see the hurt in her eyes from the day he confessed, that mix of disbelief and disappointment. He'd broken something fragile, something he hadn't even realized was being built between them. Trust. One evening, Ethan found himself sitting on the porch long after the sun went down, a cold cup of coffee in his hands. The fields stretched out before him, dark and endless, the stars above scattered like salt on black velvet. It should have been peaceful, but peace was something he hadn't known in years. He thought about Lavra, his late wife, how she used to sit beside him on this very porch, her laughter soft as wind through grass. She'd been patient, kind, and endlessly forgiving. She'd believed in second chances, even for people who didn't deserve them. Ethan wondered what she would think of him now, spying on a woman who'd only ever shown kindness. He sighed heavily and rubbed his face. You'd be ashamed of me, Lavra, he muttered into the night. I sure am. Inside, the faint sound of movement caught his ear. Through the window, he saw Maria clearing the kitchen table, stacking plates with quiet precision. He hesitated, then pushed himself up and walked back inside. Maria, he said from the doorway. She turned, startled, then composed herself. Yes, Senator Cole? He gestured toward the table. You don't have to clean up tonight. I'll handle it. She shook her head lightly. It's my job. Doesn't mean you have to do everything alone, he said gently. Sit down a minute, please. There was a long pause before she obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. Ethan took the chair opposite her, feeling clumsy and unsure. I've been thinking a lot about what I did, he began, his voice rough. I thought I was being smart, watching you like that. But really, I was just scared. Maria looked at him, her eyes cautious but not cold. Scared of what? He hesitated. Of being wrong again. After Lavra died, I stopped trusting people, anyone. It was easier to believe the worst than risk being hurt. She studied him quietly for a moment, then said, That's a hard way to live, Senator. I know, he said. And I don't want to live that way anymore. You didn't deserve how I treated you. Maria's expression softened slightly, though her voice stayed measured. Regret is good, but only if it changes something. Otherwise, it's just another kind of pride. Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. He'd spent years hiding behind grief and bitterness, calling it strength. In truth, he'd been afraid of loss, of vulnerability, of caring again. Ethan nodded slowly. Then I'll change, he said quietly. Not just for me, but for this place. Lavra loved this ranch, and I've let it fall apart. Not just the fences and barns, but everything that made it a home. Maria didn't answer right away. Then she said softly, The land forgives if you tend to it. People take longer. For the first time in months, Ethan smiled faintly. Then I'll start with the land, he said, and hope the rest follows. As he stood to leave, Maria rose too, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Good night, Senator Cole, she said quietly. Good night, Maria. He stepped out onto the porch again, the cool night air brushing against his face. Somewhere deep inside, the weight of regret began to shift, not gone, but no longer suffocating. Maybe this was what redemption felt like. Slow, painful, but possible. The following morning dawned cool and misty, the kind of quiet that always followed a night of restless thoughts. Ethan Cole rose before sunrise, as he always did, though his body felt heavier than usual. He dressed slowly, his joints stiff, and brewed a pot of strong black coffee. The house smelled faintly of soap and lavender, the trace of Maria's careful work the night before. He sat at the kitchen table, watching the light creep across the wooden floor. The events of the past week weighed on him, the spying, the confession, and the awkward, fragile peace that had followed. He'd said his apologies, but the guilt still clung like a shadow he couldn't shake after finishing his coffee. Ethan decided to do something he hadn't done in months, visit the old storage shed near the back of the property. It was where Lavra used to keep her gardening tools, seed packets, and a small chest filled with her keepsakes. He hadn't been able to step inside since her death. But after what Maria had said about forgiveness, about change, he felt a pull to go there, as if something waited for him. The shed door creaked as he opened it, the hinges stiff with rust. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight. Everything was just as Lavra had left it, the cracked clay pots, the spools of twine, the faded calendar still hanging on the wall. Frozen on the month she died. As Ethan stepped further in, he noticed a small stack of boxes pushed neatly against the wall. They weren't his doing. Someone had organized them recently. His brow furrowed. He knelt down and saw a familiar handwriting on one of the tags, Maria's, delicate but clear. Curious, he lifted the lid. Inside were Laura's belongings, carefully cleaned and wrapped in soft cloth. A few old letters, a silver brooch, and a leather-bound journal she had always carried. Ethan's breath caught. He hadn't seen that journal since the funeral. He thought it had been lost. He opened it carefully. The first pages were filled with Laura's handwriting, neat, looping, and alive. Notes about the ranch, sketches of plants, memories of the long summers they'd spent building their life together. But what stopped him cold was the last entry, written just 2 days before her death. Maria has such a kind heart. She reminds me of myself when I was younger, eager to help, but afraid of making mistakes. I want Ethan to see what I see in her. Maybe she'll bring some gentleness back into this place after I'm gone." Ethan stared at the words, his throat tightening. Lavra had known. She had seen something in Maria long before he had ever noticed. It wasn't guilt or deceit, it was loyalty. It was care. He flipped the page, and a small folded note slipped out from between the sheets. It wasn't Laura's handwriting this time. It was Maria's. "Signora Lavra, I've tried to take care of this place like you wanted. I'm sorry I couldn't be there that day. I still hear your laugh in the garden, and I hope you forgive me. Maria." Ethan sat back on his heels, the note trembling in his hand. He felt as though the walls of the shed were closing in on him. Maria hadn't returned out of guilt alone. She'd come back because of a promise, one Lavra herself had inspired. For a long time, he didn't move. The air smelled of earth and old cedar. Outside, the morning fog began to lift, revealing the wide stretch of pasture beyond the fence. When he finally stepped out of the shed, something in him felt different, lighter, though lined with sorrow. The truth had come quietly, without confrontation, without shouting. His late wife had trusted Maria with what he no longer could, kindness. And Maria had carried that trust faithfully, even when he didn't deserve it. Ethan turned toward the house. The least he could do now was honor that faith, both Laura's and Maria's. He had spent so long watching for betrayal that he'd forgotten how to see devotion, when it was right in front of him as he walked back. The morning sun broke through the mist, and for the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel haunted. It felt alive again. By the time Ethan Cole walked back to the house from the old shed, the morning sun had climbed higher, warming the dewy grass beneath his boots. His mind was still reeling from what he had found, the journal, Laura's words and Maria's quiet note tucked between the pages. Each sentence had felt like a mirror held up to his own failings. He had built his life on control, on knowing what to expect from people, on reading their intentions before they could hurt him. But Lavra had seen something he couldn't, the goodness in others, even when it was buried beneath fear or pain. Maria was proof of that. She hadn't come back to steal or to hide. She had come to keep a promise. As Ethan reached the porch, he saw Maria near the barn, carrying a bucket of feed toward the chicken coop. Her movements were steady, her back straight. Even from a distance, he could tell she was avoiding his gaze, just as she had done every day since his confession. He stood there for a moment, unsure how to begin. Apologies were one thing. True repentance was another. He had already told her he was sorry once, but now that he knew the full story, the weight of his guilt was tenfold. "Maria," he called softly. She paused and turned, shielding her eyes from the sun with one hand. "Center Cole?" He walked toward her slowly, the gravel crunching under his boots. When he stopped a few feet away, he noticed the small streak of dust across her cheek and the faint smudge of soil on her apron. She looked tired, not from the work, but from the silence that had grown between them. "I found something," he said, holding up the worn leather journal. "In the shed?" Her eyes widened slightly, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "You went there?" He nodded. "It was time. I found Laura's things. And I found your note." Maria froze. The bucket in her hand tilted slightly, the feed spilling onto the dirt. "You read it?" she asked quietly. "I did." His voice softened. "And I needed to. I needed to understand why you came back." Maria turned away, her shoulders stiff. "I shouldn't have written that. It wasn't meant for you." "I know," he said, "but I'm glad I read it anyway." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Lavra trusted you. She saw something good in you before I ever did. And you honored that, even when I treated you like a criminal." Maria said nothing. The chickens clucked softly behind her, pecking at the spilled grain. Ethan continued, his words trembling now. "I accused you of theft, spied on you in your own workspace, and thought the worst of you, when all you did was try to take care of what my wife loved most. I can't undo that. But I can tell you this, I'm ashamed of myself." Maria looked at him then, really looked at him, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't anger. It was sorrow, deep and tired. "She believed in forgiveness," Maria said quietly. "Your wife. She told me once that people can lose themselves after grief, but they can find their way back if they're brave enough to admit they're lost." Ethan's throat tightened. "Then I guess this is me admitting it. I've been lost for a long time, Maria." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maria set down the empty bucket and wiped her hands on her apron. "I believe you mean it," she said softly. "But believing you're sorry and trusting you again, that's not the same." He nodded. "I don't expect it to be. I want to make things right. If you'll stay, I'll make sure you never have to feel unwelcome here again." Maria hesitated, looking out over the fields. The morning light glinted off the fence posts, the grass rippling like waves in the wind. "I'll stay," she said finally. "Not for you, Senator Cole, but for her. For Lavra." Ethan managed a small, grateful smile. "That's enough for me." As she turned back toward the barn, Ethan stood there a moment longer, holding Laura's journal to his chest. The words written inside weren't just his wife's last thoughts. They were a bridge between past and present, between regret and redemption. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a man haunted by what he'd lost. He felt like a man being given one last chance to rebuild what still remained. Weeks passed, and the coal ranch began to change, not overnight, but slowly, like winter thawing into spring. The fences that had sagged for years were mended. The stables, once half empty, filled again with the familiar sounds of neighs and soft hoofbeats. And though Ethan Cole still moved through his days with the stiffness of age and regret, there was something new in him now, a quiet determination, a gentleness returning to his voice. Maria stayed on, true to her word. She rose before dawn, worked hard, and never complained. Yet something had shifted between them. Their conversations, once awkward and stilted, grew easier. They spoke about the ranch, the animals, and even Lavra, not with pain, but with a kind of reverence. One afternoon, Ethan found Maria tending to the small garden behind the house, the same one Lavra had planted years ago, but that had long since gone wild. Maria was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds with her bare hands. The sun glowed warm on her shoulders. "You've brought it back to life," Ethan said. Approaching quietly, Maria looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It was never dead," she said simply. "Just neglected." He smiled faintly at that, realizing how true her words were, not just about the garden, but about everything. For years, he'd let grief and bitterness choke out the life in this place. It had taken someone else's care, someone else's forgiveness, to remind him that healing required tending, not control. "I was thinking," he began after a pause, "this place has always needed more than one pair of hands. Someone who sees what I can't, someone who cares about it the way Lavra did." Maria tilted her head, wary. "What are you saying?" "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as my maid, as the ranch manager. You've earned that." "More than anyone," she blinked, clearly taken aback. "Me?" "I don't know if You are," Ethan interrupted gently. "You've kept this place running when I was too blind to see it falling apart. And I trust you now, Maria, fully." For a long moment, she said nothing. The wind rustled the leaves of the garden, carrying the scent of earth and lavender. Then slowly Maria smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "If you're sure, Senator Cole, then I'll do my best." "I know you will," he said. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began to feel alive again. Maria took charge of organizing repairs, hiring new help, and restoring the fields. The workers respected her quiet authority, and for the first time in years, laughter drifted across the property again. Ethan watched it all with a quiet pride, often catching glimpses of Laura's spirit in the small things. The order Maria brought to the chaos, the way she talked to the horses as if they were old friends, the patience she had for the land. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan stood on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Maria, who joined him in silence. The fields stretched endlessly before them, glowing amber in the dying light. "She'd be proud of you," he said after a while. Maria looked out toward the horizon. "No," she said softly. "She'd be proud of us." Ethan nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the hollow ache of loss. Instead, he felt something steadier. Peace. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to bloom across the sky, the ranch no longer felt haunted. It felt like home again. Ethan glanced at Maria, the woman he had once wronged but who had somehow become the heart of the place. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes kind. "No, Senator Cole, thank you for finally waking up." And though she meant it as a gentle jest, Ethan couldn't help but smile. Because she was right. After years of pretending to be asleep to his own pain, he had finally opened his eyes.